Yeah, thank you, Paros. Thank you, Amit, for this kind and generous welcome. It's really good to be back at JNU. It's not the first time that I've been here since the pandemic, but it really makes one feel how disruptive the pandemic has been in terms of the dialogues we had built over the years, and I'm very much looking forward to intensifying this. I said before that I've slightly dry-mouthed to speak in the presence of two IFTR presidents, because clearly, and you'll see that this kind of informs also what I try to argue for here, is an attempt to think differently about theater and performance studies, and that is in a genuinely global perspective, without falling into the shortcomings of concepts and ideas that sort of are asymmetric or one-sided. So today what I will try to do is to introduce the question of theater historiography in general. How do we write theater history? How does theater history come to us at all? And then we'll sort of delve into different specific cases also with guests who join us for the various sessions in the coming days. It is interesting that while theater history sort of is mandatory in almost all degrees for theater and performance studies, that it kind of is the unloved, awkward uncle who is always present at dinner, but no one really sort of wants to address. And I think partly this has to do with the situation that we find in textbooks. Can we? Yes, now it works. In most US American colleges, it is still Brockett and Hildy, the World Theater of History, that sort of is used to sort of broaden the scope. It still is run on certain principles that are deeply entrenched in the Western thinking about history, and now we, yeah, that's and how we think about history and the lasting effects of history. An interesting alternative to this is the book Theater Histories, that sort of tried deliberately to turn its back to traditional concepts of chronology and organizing theater history, partly to the price of providing something that's very difficult to teach and actually requires that you have read Brockett before you read this one. The third major project of recent years is The Cultural History of Theater by Barman Davis, published in 2017. This is a 6-volume set sponsored or commissioned by Bloomsbury Press, and it sort of also tries to give a different approach to theater history that Barman Davis have described as cultural history. But at the same time, and I can say this very deliberately because I'm guilty of editing one of the volumes, at the same time, if you look at the systematic in which it is built, it is very rigid, and it sort of really is very Euro and US UK centered in its outline. I think really we are in demand of doing better when it comes to that. In 2020, 2 major publications appeared on the issue of theater historiography, and I think this partly is a response to the impression that it is not the genre of the textbook itself that will sort of offer us different perspectives, but rather to take 2 or 3, maybe 5 steps back and to think differently on how we conceive of history as an intellectual space in which we try to find ourselves in. But how does theater history come to us? How do we sort of encounter theater history? And I brought you a couple of examples, mostly from our Cologne collection, sort of to give you some idea of what is left from theater. Because in contrast to many other art forms, many other social practices, theater is always absent already when the theater historian comes to the site. So this is these are the most awkward objects we have in our collection. The original silk stockings of Caruso for the part in Un ballo in maschera, and cufflinks with his own caricature. And so I became director of this collection 12 years ago, and ever since I've been thinking about the silk stockings. I'm not in a kinky way, but sort of rather wondering what could one ever do with those silk stockings. And I think it is interesting because it also reminds us that obviously there is a different sense that is due to the ephemerality of theater that makes people to long for objects that are the closest to the theatrical event as possible. We watched them nevertheless. So, but it's still sort of, it transpires the idea that we know from Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, the idea of the relic as something that has stored a specific kind of energy that might transpire to the onlooker. But at the same time, for sure, it doesn't do anything to the theater historian, unless you want to write a theater history from the perspective of the silk stocking in Verdi Productions in New York. The same is true for these interesting figures of Edmund Kean as Richard III, who sort of are a mass product from the early 19th century. And they are interesting insofar as they tell us something about the social place of theater in England in the beginning of the 19th century, where people sort of longed for props. We have many chairs here. I can...
many chairs. They come.
Amit, here's another one. So it kind of is important to acknowledge that these statues tell us little to nothing about the actual performance of Kean as Richard III, but they tell us something about the longing of the spectators to have a prop they could display and sort of that deals with their memories. A different strategy of memorializing himself as an actor was conducted by the famous English actor David Garrick. David Garrick was kind of the first global superstar of the 18th century. And Garrick is partly responsible for the cult about William Shakespeare as a person. He was the first who ostentatiously traveled to Stratford-upon-Avon to see the birthplace of Shakespeare, but he also built a small temple for Shakespeare in his own garden. So it's small wonder that sort of Garrick kind of piggybacks on the fame of Shakespeare, on trying to present Shakespeare as a saint or as a deity that sort of is meant to ensure his own fame as an actor. And here you see these sides of the cult. So this is another way how theater history comes to us. What might be more to the point of our general question to get to theater historiography are these porcelain figures who were developed in the 18th century. These are Meissen statues from our collection who represent characters of the Italian Commedia dell'arte. The Italian Commedia dell'arte was an artistic form developed in the 16th century that is usually considered to be a non-literary theatrical form. So the Commedia dell'arte figures sort of pose the question, how do we commemoralize something that doesn't leave linguistic traces in the age before photography and audiovisual recording? But again, as with the statues of Kean, we have the case of, a faint memory of something that is sort of put into a specific cast and form that sort of offers this historic dimension without really allowing us to interact with the historical past. And finally, probably what is most familiar to us, we have the sort of development of the signed or autographed photography with the new technology developing in the mid-19th century. This is one of the oldest photographs in our collection. It shows the Jewish actor Bogomil Davison in his most famous signature role of Shylock in 1859. So clearly, theater leaves a lot of material traces, but these traces are sort of not telling very much unless we try to open them up. So when I thought about how to get to the point of theater historiography with you, I thought it would be good to start with the question how theater studies became an academic discipline. And this partly happened through the idea of theater history as a kind of universal history. Theater history has long been considered as a subchapter of literary history. So this is no novelty, and with the rise of philology in the 19th century, sort of also people recognize that there's a literary form that deals with the question of drama and acting. But also during the 19th century, a couple of discourses conflate, and they have to do with an experience that scholars make that makes them realize that maybe textual practices are only a small fraction of cultural negotiations. And these practices have to do with the objects I have brought here. These are two carnival masks, very seasonal by the way, because carnival is around the corner in Cologne. These are carnival masks from the southern part of Germany, and it was that these masks that sort of draw the attention of scholars to the fact that there's a broad and long-standing tradition in Europe of corporeal physical practices that follow certain patterns but are not necessarily scripted in the way of following a dramatic script, a literary formula. So following the path of the masks, one comes across, for example, a manuscript like this Schembart book from 1539, which documents masked performances in Nuremberg in the 15th and 16th century. The Schembart book is interesting because it also draws our attention to one of the key problems of theater history, because these illuminated manuscripts sort of are created at the point when the practice is banned from the city of Nuremberg. So this is just a faint memory of an earlier sort of physical practice. It was the idea of carnival, of folk rituals, that steered up the idea of performance as a cultural factor in its own right that would need to be also academically addressed. And it is the question of the mask in particular that sort of raised the attention of scholars. I brought you two pictures from, these are stone masks who are about 9,000 years old, and they are considered to be the early masked objects, not very, you might know them from popular culture movies in an uncanny way. But sort of this started to, this instilled people to think about the question of performance as something that predates literary practices. And there has been a long tradition, and I'm not advocating this tradition by the way, but there has been a long tradition of people saying it is the object of the mask that stands at the beginning of the process of people starting to perform and to narrate. And this is something that begins in the 19th century and it ends in the or one of the other highlights is the 20th century, where various avant-garde movements, like the Polish director Tadeusz Kantor, sort of described the mask as the first primal scene, the encounter of the human being with death as the seed of all theatrical practices. I just go back to Nuremberg because otherwise you will be scared and will not listen to me. One of the most influential thinkers in the Western discourse in that direction is the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote a big book called The Origin of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. Die Geburt der Tragödie aus dem Geist der Musik. And Nietzsche makes an interesting argument, which I think informs many of our thinkings about theater and theater history in the Western discourse until today. Nietzsche argues that other than the literary tradition since the Renaissance told us, the Greek culture was not only a literary culture. And Nietzsche identifies this literary tradition, this intellectual, rational tradition, with the deity of Apollo. And he says it's not only Apollo, it's not only the enlightenment, it's not only the narrative, it's not only the morals of a specific performance, but there's also a physical practice that informs the cultural practices of the Greeks. And these practices he identifies with the Greek god Dionysus. And he says Dionysus is the deity of transformation. So according to according to Nietzsche, the Apollinic tradition is one of the intellect, is one of rational understanding, is one of interpretation, whereas the Dionysic tradition is one of transformation and transgression. And he identifies the mask as one of the key elements of this act of transformation. So while in the Western tradition, especially since the 18th century, something we're going to talk a little bit more about tomorrow, while the Western tradition of acting sort of at a certain point started to focus on the idea of an intellectual and emotional embracement of the actor, of the part he wants to represent, the Dionysic logic would be one of radical transformation, losing one's subjectivity for a certain period of time in order to become a different being. And it is this model of the ritualistic representation that sort of informs the thinking about theater and performance that stands at the beginning of the academic dealing with theater history. So why am I telling you all this stuff on a Saturday afternoon where you could do better things? I tried to develop sort of the mindset that helps us to understand what is wired into the idea of theater historiography once it enters the academic discourse. So once it's no longer the business of fans, of people who are enthusiasts, but sort of once it becomes an intellectual enterprise in its own right, a scholarly enterprise. And Nietzsche sort of is the godfather of many of these developments. In 1912, at Columbia University, the scholar Brenda Matthews gets appointed as chair for drama and theater, and he writes in his book, The Development of Drama, I quote, and I apologize for the wording, "In the childhood of a race or an individual, we discover that the lyric, the dramatic, and the narrative are only imperfectly differentiated from one another. And we can gain some insight into primitive conditions of drama by going back to our own childhood, since youth is the special season of make-believe, strong as that instinct is in all the 7 ages of man," unquote. What is interesting is how Brenda Matthews sort of conflates the individual psychological development that he assumes everyone undergoes with a larger sort of evolutionary logic, and also that he tries to implement the logic that usually is drawn back to Aristotle of the three genres as something that defines the core capacity of human beings. The Danish writer Carl Mancius, in about the same time, sort of tries to transfer these ideas to a cultural geography. I quote, "It is interesting to notice that the Greek drama, so poetical and perfect in form, does not differ essentially from the religious festivals of the Indians of the Northwest, or that the masks and farces which are still performed in civilized Europe find analogies, for instance, among the Melanesian people, inhabitants of the South Sea Islands. We have set ourselves the task of first of all pointing out some fundamental features in the earliest stage of dramatic art, during which all nations may be treated nearly alike, and of subsequently giving an account of the forms of acting in use among some nations of more advanced civilizations." This, of course, is the tone of Western colonization, of Western supremacy, the claim for hegemony, that he sort of, on the one hand, describes a common denominator, but on the other hand, sort of tries to differentiate this. But Mancius, Brendan Matthews, and many other scholars around 1900 sort of were trying to grasp the idea that if Nietzsche is right, and that if performative practices are a core element of cultural development, how can we get hold of this history? How can we write this history? At the same time, it's important to acknowledge the bias towards European and Western culture and to see how much it aligns itself with the colonial project of the global North. Maybe for a second, we take a look on how this sort of played out in a very concrete research program, and we take a look at what happens in Cologne. So this is my five-time predecessor, Carl Niesen, who was the first professor of theater studies at the University of Cologne and who founded the collection that actually is a remarkable collection, but also sort of needs kind of rethinking of history and historiography. So Niesen started this collection, and this sets him apart from many of his contemporaries with a genuinely omnivoric appetite. He tried to get hold of everything related to theater. And this is true to what we are doing until today. So he started collecting puppets, shadow figures, masks, photographs, reviews, books, sketches of costumes and set designs, maquettes, whatever. And he never sort of refused anything to be taken into the collection. And this is partly due to the anthropological idea that theater sort of is something related to what human beings or how human beings relate themselves to the world. But it is also due to the fact that he felt that if we are facing this challenge of writing a history that does not express itself explicitly in language, we need to sort of develop new methods and methodologies. And Niesen is an interesting example because for once he was really a social crackpot. I think he was a nasty person to meet. We have all his letters and they all follow the same pattern. The first 5 letters are nice and cozy. And then he falls out with almost everyone. But he's, I mean, that's good for party talk. But sort of interesting he's also because he failed at what he was doing. So he understood the importance of visual documents to write this history. And he compiled images of images of images. This is a very early publication, actually quite remarkable, from the 1920s, something he called the maps of set design. And these were, I think, 75 maps altogether, where he sort of tried to just provide visual documentation to find similar patterns. What you see on the right is his private collection of slides. He was known as the professor with the lecture of 1,000 slides, where he randomly sort of composed all these images, and he desperately tried to find patterns. He followed this idea of a universalist idea. He was partly following the line of Jane Ellen Harrison, one of the Cambridge ritualists, who argued that all theater is related to death rituals. And he was desperately trying to find these common patterns across different cultures and centuries. And of course, like most polymaths, he was mostly wrong and terribly wrong. But he also failed, I come to another failure, but first of all, a small success. The other thing he tried an early attempt of practice as research. So he staged some of these historical plays with his students. Here you see, this is a Cologne version of Everyman that he staged in the 1920s, and another early modern play, Theophilus, that he staged interestingly in one of Cologne's leading museums, where he put it into the context of medieval art, and he felt it might transpire some energy. Something interesting as an art project, from an historical point of view, I think disastrous. But he also failed, and this is an admonition for every one of us who tries to write anything, because he never got his projects finished. So this is how his manuscripts look. For those of us who are digital natives, welcome, nice to see you, especially those on YouTube. This is what copy-paste looked before the digital. It means cut and glue. And his opus magnum was meant to be the so-called Handbuch der Theaterwissenschaft, Handbook of Theater History. It was meant to contain 10 volumes, and only the first one was published with 1,000 pages. And it was always considered that he never finished the other ones. But we got, when his widow died in 2012, we got all sort of what was left in his private study. And these were 80 moving boxes full of manuscripts. And it's a nightmare, and it's not a good nightmare. It's not one of those tasks where you say, well, just, it's a jigsaw puzzle, be patient, and you'll sort of define that he really was smart. This is sort of arbitrary crap. And actually it's not crap, because he sort of collected all these small details, glued them together and tried to make an argument. And then he felt, no, it should be different, cut it up, glued it again. So what we see is that this universalist approach sort of necessarily fails because he tried to find guiding patterns that were universal. So one of the legacies of Carl Niesen, I would argue, is the failure of this model of the idea of universal guiding patterns. Two quotes. Niesen is an interesting case for two reasons. On the one hand, he returned from the First World War as a conservative, folkish intellectual, voicing rather anti-modern sentiments and regarded culture as the expression of an essence of a community. So this is sort of the conservative version of so many cultural theories we know of. Yet his method of research contradicted his conviction insofar as it departed from the idea of general comparability and thus thwarting the idea of any superiority or hegemonic claim. And finally, to sum this up, the discovery of performance as an academic field marks an important intellectual turning point that fuels scholarly discussion well into the 20th century. By acknowledging the distinction between drama and performance, a light was shone on performance studies, a field that had been previously marginalized or even regarded as inferior. No one talked about carnival apart from those who sort of were interested in folklore. At the same time, the study of the materiality of theater, the material artifacts that would substantiate the significance of the historical dimension of drama, helped to integrate theater into the canon of cultural phenomena and to demonstrate its independence from the field of literature. So you might think that this is one of those scholarly hobby horses, where we sort of try to annoy our neighbors from other departments by claiming independence or to being the smarter ones. But I think it really tells us something about the challenges we face when we try to write the history of this slippery phenomenon that is theater and performance. So let me come to a couple of conclusions and questions. So theater becomes only an academic topic because it has a history. This is mandatory for the academic system at the beginning of the 20th century. Only because people make the claim that there is carnival, there are pageants, there are certain folk customs and rituals, it becomes a legitimate topic. Following this path, the idea of a universalist approach sort of happens. Nietzsche and the Cambridge ritualists foreground this idea as something that sort of is as important and as meaningful as literature and other art forms are. But this universalism is always constructed as a westernized evolutionary logic. If you think of Brandon Matthews, the idea we have to think back to our own childhood, implying that other cultures might still be in a childish state of constitution. And part of this legacy, and I think this is really something where we need to do a little bit more homework in the field of theater and performance studies, is still present post 1945, for example, in the formulation of performance studies by Richard Schechner and Victor Turner. And the proximity of theater history and anthropology reproduces stereotypes and fixed patterns in many cases. So it really sort of prevents us to see more complicated constellations. From this arise a couple of questions. The first one is, how do we overcome the narrow concept of theater that is inscribed in this version of a universalist theater history? How do we get away from the idea, for example, that theater is always bound to the human performer? How do we get away from certain concepts that sort of are aligned with this universalist theory? How do we acknowledge the complex interplay of theater performance with other forms of representation and narration? The closest to theater I can think of are puppetry, shadow puppetry, musical forms of representation and narration, etc., etc. How can we, quote unquote, provincialize Europe in the sense of showing the contingencies of its aesthetics? How do we overcome sort of this evolutionary DNA of writing history, cultural history, as if only the model that started with Aristotle is the only option that we can think of? Maybe this would be a good point to take questions. This feels like a Monday morning class.
Yeah, thank you for this very, very engaging introduction to some of the questions which are going to be taken up in the course. And this is more about this whole binary between theory, theater and anthropology, where you cite Richard Schechner, somebody who's located in both these fields, and he also does a lot of comparative theater. And I'm interested in how he brings in theater from, say, Sanskrit context, like Bharatanatyam. He's done a study of it, and then he brings in this whole divide between the centrality of the body in Indian theatre, as opposed to something which is more intellectual, which also becomes extremely problematic.
Absolutely.
Because where do you bring in the idea of theory coming from this very context, which is pushed under anthropology?
Well, first of all, my first suggestion would be that we clarify there is no way to write the universal history of theater. but that we sort of have to think in a most radical way in constellations and contexts. And that sort of we, rather in sort of trying to identify joint patterns, we have to seek for questions how theater is located and situated in different societies and to what it appeals. So I think I completely see how important Schechner, and I acknowledge how important Schechner and his reference to Turner is for the 1960s and 70s in the US. I think it's symptomatic and indicative of what is going on there. It becomes problematic as soon as he tries to develop a general rule out of that. And if we try to think in constellations and contingencies, I think the first step is to really question the concepts with which we work in the most radical way. So when I was speaking about the interrelation of theater and other forms of representation before, I think it's exactly the question, how do we conceive of a puppet or a shadow figure vis-a-vis different forms of performers? I mean, nowadays there are so many artists who mix these forms all the time, so the question arises anyway, because we can see a figure that sort of undergoes different metamorphoses through different media. But I think the question is more general. So I'm extremely skeptical, or I would be extremely cautious, for example, to deploy certain semiotic models and saying this is just semiotics, this is before culture. No, even semiotics is a culturally biased theory and system. So I think the concept I try to suggest, just to spoil the next 60 minutes, is the idea of a polyphonic approach to theater history. And polyphonic in the sense of sort of really trying to hear as many voices and hear as many concepts as possible. Has that answered your question? I mean, they pretend to be shy. What do we do now? Oh, okay, so you ask, oh, sorry, sure.
Yeah, thank you. So I was just thinking in terms of like your proposition, where I was saying that how perhaps theater history itself is becoming a problem, where so very institutionalization of theater studies, where perhaps you are not able to capture the theater history is not able to capture some of those kinds of, say, non-linguistic theater in one way, like either you're talking about puppet, carnival and all those stuffs, then that itself is becoming some kinds of like a problem of history. So one way of maybe there are three ways of thinking about these questions. One is that very a specific way of broadening the idea of theater, that theater is not just a written idea of theater or dramatic or plays, but theater is many other things, different kinds of enactment. Other way of thinking, maybe very Nietzsche way of saying that it's like more Dionysian mode of thinking about theater, where you are not thinking through the mind, but it's also about more corporeal formation of the theater that is happening. And third model perhaps would be more anthropological way of maybe bringing these complexities. But how then these two models, one that coming from more universalist idea of thinking about Dionysian idea of theater, where carnival, ritual all becomes part of that, to what extent those models are one can say that whether it is not still fitting into the theater history frame per se, but other way of thinking about that perhaps you are going into the domain of performance studies and doing some kinds of justification to the, so just wanted some of your reflections on that.
Thank you so much. First of all, I think we should be much less anxious about borders of discipline than we sometimes are. And I say this coming from a country that sort of excels at academic anxiety when it comes to the borders of discipline. The dream of every German professor is to have a proper copper plate in front of his house saying this is the institute for X or Y. I think we see much more sort of back and forth going between the disciplines. So my first plea would be, let's be a little bit more relaxed, especially in the humanities, and sort of try to think more creatively. Allow me to sort of illustrate my case with a small example, with two conclusions. there's a table in Brockett which is very self-evident, and it seems to be very hard to argue with. There's a table in Brockett saying these are the dates of purpose-built theaters in the early modern period in Europe. And they have Italy, England, Spain, France. It is not local pride that I feel offended that the better part of Germany doesn't, Europe doesn't even appear, but it really made me think very hard that obviously taking something that seems to be such a neutral idea, like the idea of the purpose-built theater, and this is even deeply wired into a specific kind of logic that comes from the 19th century municipal bourgeois theater. And then I started to do some research, and I discovered, of course, many German cities, for example, many European cities in general, had houses that were used for performing theater. But these would be temporary usages of these buildings. And they would see absolutely no rationale in building a house only for theater. So the city of Nuremberg had the so-called Fechthaus, which was called Fechthaus because it had a huge arena and was meant for show fights. But there were also acrobats and jugglers and performers, and it seated 4,000 spectators. So this was highly effective. So obviously what Brockett, and I'm sorry that I'm always scapegoating Brockett, but I think he made a lot of money with the book, so I think he can take it. So obviously what Brockett didn't get is that sometimes theater is not what resembles the 19th century municipal theater. The second point is historians love stones, because the stone seems to embody the idea of durability, of something that is firmly grounded in a society. In the middle of the 18th century, the slightly suspicious and dubious theater entrepreneur Kurz Bernardon had built a theater for 1,500 spectators in Frankfurt. And then he fell out with the magistrate of Frankfurt, and he simply dismantled the wooden structure of his theater and took it up the Rhine to Cologne, where he built it again. With stone, this would be a completely loss. So obviously, the historian's obsession with stone might not be the smartest thing in the world. So something that seems to be so self-evidently represent the idea of durability, social commitment, the fact that something is heavily grounded in a society, might be misleading when we think about the different purposes in economics. And I think this also sort of plays into the question of concepts and approaches. I think we need to, if we start to think in constellations, then sometimes mobility is more important than durability. Multi-purpose might be more attractive to a magistrate than having a theater and permanently actors in town, which for early modern magistrates in Europe was not a pleasant idea. So I think we are still trying to get out of this conceptual prison of the bourgeois society of the 19th century. We still think in terms of nation, we still think in terms of linguistic homogeneity, we still think in terms of durability that is defined by bourgeois categories. And what we need is sort of to understand that once we start to think in constellations, we really get into a position to see more things that we haven't seen before. So, if one last anecdote, if you pardon me. Since I'm a student of her, I twice a year call Erika Fischer-Lichter. I assume that most of you know Erika Fischer-Lichter. And during the pandemic, we all were very frustrated because we couldn't go to JNU and couldn't not do a lot of other things. So I called her, and we had this long chat, and then at a certain point I said, well, Mrs. Fischer-Lichter, as a former student I still call her Mrs. Fischer-Lichter, of course, I'm German. There's one thing that I learned as a theater historian from the pandemic. And she said, now tell me, what did you learn from that? I said, that the idea of a theater with a roof on top of it is bad if you have to deal with pandemics. So very often we consider the public playhouses of the Elizabethan age as something that sort of just predates the idea that you could go inside and have a proper performance and lighting and all that stuff, snacks and a foyer. But in a society that is regularly visited by plague, it's good to have some fresh air. So people might not have felt the need, the urge to move on to indoor performances. And this is what I mean by thinking about constellations. Shall we move on? Shall we move on? Are you with me? Okay. So one of the questions that sort of interests me, or sort of really catches my attention as a scholar, is how do we conceive differently of theater and performance? And there's a concept that was developed by theologians in the 19th century when working on the Bible as a text that I find extremely helpful, and the German word is Sitz im Leben, seat in life. And it means to ask, where is theater and performance located? Before we start with programs, with aesthetics, with social organization, with spaces, with whatever, let's go back to the question, what is the social space? What is the social seat of theater? Sitz im Leben. I find that very helpful. So I would like to take you on a small mental journey back into the year 1582. In 1582 in Constantinople, the Sultan Murad III celebrated a 40-day long festival. Eventually it lasted 55 days, but that's a different story. Festival to celebrate the circumcision of his son. And this was a genuinely global event, because Murad III sort of made sure that not only his friends and representatives from all parts of his empire were there, but also his adversaries from east and west. So this is an extremely well documented event in the year 1582. And it was sort of in the Hippodrome of Constantinople, which is the old racing arena from the day of Constantine. And every day followed the same pattern. So some guilds, some military units sort of would present themselves, they would do something, and in the evening they would have a firework. They would have so many fireworks that the ambassador of Elizabeth I would write in his report, and then the usual fireworks. And you can see that it really sort of tires him out. But I'm not, this time I don't want to talk about fireworks. And Murad III sort of made sure that this festival was not only visited and described by as many people as possible. We have about 24 European descriptions of the festival alone. But he also had his palace, the artist at his palace, create the Tsunami Humayun, which is an extensive manuscript, illuminated manuscript containing more than 400 illuminations documenting each and every single day. So we know, we have an idea, and we sort of can read it against other sources. And one day, during this, in principle, very merry festival, there was a cart drawn into the Hippodrome displaying the mutilated body of a young man. Sorry. Here you see the bleeding and mutilated body parts. Well, this is the early modern period, so people were not used to the presentation and demonstration of violence. Public executions were very visible. So, but still, this was an extremely disruptive moment in this merry celebration of the festival. But can you imagine the affect that must have taken hold of the audience once the body parts started to move? And it turned out this was nothing but a stage trick. So 5 healthy young men climbed out of the cart and sort of made clear that this was just some form of performative trick they did for the Sultan. And it's interesting that, and I compared testimonies from different languages, they all describe this really as a deeply affective moment. The Turkish text says something like, once the spectators re-emerged from the sea of amazement, they started what happened. So this really sort of shook the audience to the core. And it's interesting because sort of we have a very clear visual description also how the trick worked. So this had a huge effect. When I started to look into a book by Reginald Scott, published in the year 1584, The Discovery of Witchcraft, I came across the very same trick. But here it's called the decapitation of St. John. So it is sort of interpreted in a Christian context. And what is particularly interesting about Scott's description is that he mentions, that this was performed in the Bartholomew View in 1582. So Constantinople was somewhere in June. Bartholomew View usually took place in August or September. And it was performed by one Kingfield, a performer we know nothing else about. But clearly this performance, or the trick, let's be more precise, the trick was traveling from Constantinople to London, and it also appeared in a publication called the Hocus Pocus, which is a manual for stage magic published in various editions in the 17th century, where it's also described and also shown as the decapitation of St. John. So obviously, well, this was not legitimate theater in the sense of literary theater. Clearly meant that this was a very vibrant scene of performer of acrobats who easily traveled across borders of religion, political borders, and social borders. There's a interesting manuscript De Subtilitate by Girolamo Cardano, who sort of is published a little bit earlier, and he gives a full description on those who perform these wonders. So Cardano is confronting himself with one of the key questions of the early modern period: are there miracles and are there demons? Cardano writes, I quote, they show a child without a head and the head without the child, but they are all alive and the child comes to no harm in the meantime. If I were to list how many and how impressive things can be done with small wooden statues, I would run out of daylight. And then he tries to describe who is doing this. And he says, that's an English translation from 2013, he says, others belong to the tribe of actors, or are dancers, and beside being harmless, they give a good deal of pleasure and are not barred anywhere by laws. So instead of thinking of the early modern period as a period that is harshly divided by political frontiers, by the confrontation of different political systems, we have to think about performance practices that travel across these borders. they enter different constellations, they get different concepts, they get different translations, but it's very evident that something is going on here. I looked up this because the English translation is a little bit too contemporary, I think. And what Cardano said is "e memorum genere," sort of that has the idea of a specific kind of people, sort of who are mimes or acrobats or jugglers. So clearly something that we so often miss when we think about theater. Here I brought you a couple of images that sort of try to trace these ex memorum genere, this tribe of actors, and the different forms they might have. Here you have stage magicians who do this game with the little balls, which you find here as well. You have tightrope walkers and all different forms of performance, among them, for example, people who train cats to walk the tightrope. So I think one point in thinking about theater history is to think about this vague concept of the tribe of actors. What does fall into this concept? I have an unresponded love for diagrams, as you will learn during the next 5 days. They never are as transparent as I hope for, but I can't stop making them. So what what plays into the fact of Schauspielen, of acting? Well, it has to do with gender politics, with medical condition. It has to do with the concept of transformation, social habitus, identity, but also fashion, physiognomy, and also what is described here as shadow punishment, the idea to what extent actors are legally fully responsible for what they are doing when they are acting. So acting is not just a question of aesthetics, it's not just a question of technique, but it is always something that happens in different constellations, but it sort of evokes all these fields as something that we have to consider. And there's, I think, an important addition to make, because it also invokes the question of skills. Whoever tried to manipulate a marionette will see how difficult that is. So you need to be trained in whatever form of performance you engage. But it also includes something on the part of the audience, and that is a literacy, an ars spectandi, a way how to read a performance. Because this is one of the biggest problems, I think, in the Western tradition to think about theater, is that we consider theater as self-explaining. So if we try to historicize Schauspielen, we come to a couple of conclusions. And that is, actors' bodies are contested sites. They sort of always fall in between different social categories. There's a question of professionalization versus discursive concepts like ritual, obsession, or trance. And many of these aspects evade traditional classifications. They simply don't come up. We simply don't ask about them. A cultural archaeology of acting, and acting here is just the beginning of an attempt to describe this larger process of theater history. A cultural archaeology would try to make these different layers visible, to show to what extent they come into play. It has to work with various heterogeneous kinds of sources. And it also will not seek unifying conceptual framework, but highlights anachronisms, simultaneities, and incongruencies. And especially these three terms, anachronism, simultaneity, and incongruity, is something that so often falls out of our thinking about history. So, if we limit theater to a specific semiotic form, as neutral as semiotics seems to be, we will not get away with the evolutionary DNA that comes with this idea of semiotics. Semiotic analysis, of course, can be very helpful and very useful in describing the phenomena, but we must be very cautious to take this at the core or as the core of our definition. Theater and performance history starts with the acknowledgement of a lack of proper sources and the necessity to develop a language to talk about theater and performance. And I think really this is a major task. Develop a language to talk about theater and performance, and a language that should be not idiosyncratic, but really being able to communicate across different fields. Theater and performance has, from the beginning of its history, been an itinerant border-crossing practice. Even more, it has been used as a way to negotiate cultural, political, economical, and intellectual relations. This is what the case of Murat III shows, to what extent these acrobats, these jugglers, sort of also are a way to create a communication across borders. And I think there's a hidden history of failing performances. We should pay much more attention to failing performances. We all look for the masterpiece, but in terms of the cultural history, sometimes the failing performance is much more interesting. The problem is that most of the protagonists remain in the dark, or at best in the half shadow, so this idea of the tribe of the actors is an interesting figure of thought, because it works like a black box. So we know they are there, we know not exactly how people enter the trade, we know not exactly sort of what their biographies are, but it's a challenge to think about this black box. In contrast to many other representative forms and art forms, theater cannot be thought without a social context in which it appears. So therefore, I think this idea of the Sitz im Leben is especially productive and provocative. And this is sort of, before I come to the next chapter, on how the outlines of such an approach could look like. But there might be time for questions or remarks, contradictions. You realize that when you don't ask questions, I will just carry on, right? I don't mean to threaten you, I'm just saying.
In your diagram, you mentioned shadow punishment.
Yeah.
What is that? I mean, I could not understand.
Thanks for asking. The shadow punishment is a legal it's a legal construction that was in place until the mid 18th century, and it meant that actors were not full juridical subjects. So if they thought compensation in terms of physical punishment, the punishment would only be conducted towards the shadow of the offender. And there are even some cases where the mirror image is beaten. And I think it's I think it's more complex than most historians of the law think, because I think it's not simply mockery, there are more implications here. But to me, this was a stand-in to say there's a question of the legal status of the people in the trade. Sort of to what extent can they sort of make their cases against the society? So that's why I took that.
Does that mean that they're not full subjects?
Well, they were the German word is even more impolite, because they would be described as unehrliche, so dishonest people. So they would not have full civil rights. In many cases, they could be expelled at the magistrate's wish at any point. And as I said, it was very, very difficult to make their claims in court. We have, for example, the case of Katharina Elisabeth Felten, and this is the 1690s. and she's laboring, and she's about to give birth to her daughter, and the magistrate just kicks her out of the city because you don't want to have another actor, even if he's just born, in the walls of your city. So really there's a long story of discrimination and cruelty that sort of is associated with this idea of supplementary punishments.
There are a lot of questions in
I see. Okay.
box. Shall we take one question from there? Otherwise,
Yeah.
I think a lot of questions in the comment box.
It's like in these early 1980s TV shows, right, where you could call in.
I'll just read out. There are 4 questions. Okay. There are 4 questions. I'll just read out. What is the importance and significance of recording history in the realm of performing arts? What or whose perspective is important to look through, and what lens is to be considered? Other than tracing dates and timelines, record how to trace the cultural progress and the missing gaps or links. If the person or practitioner is dead, what should be the approach to find and fill the gap of the performing arts history for particular art form, and how?
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge the gap and sort of not to try or to live by the illusion that we could bridge that. For a long time, theater history had this fantasy of reconstructing performances. And I think this is a lost case from the scratch, because we cannot sort of reconstruct something that is lost in time. So starting with the acknowledgement that all the evidence we have is just a fragment of the larger story helps, because it helps us to see where it is broken from. And in this sense, I think of theater and performance as something that is in between people or social groups. So I would say theater history is something that in principle calls for this multi-perspective approach, what I called before a polyphonic approach. So it's not a single lens. I think it's not, of course we could write a certain type of theater history from the eyes of the practitioner or from the eyes of the ingenious director or the ingenious actor, but I think that always would remain incomplete if we ask for the Sitz im Leben. If we are interested in the social position of theater and performance, and to my conviction this would be the most important facet of theater history, we need to embrace as many perspectives as possible. But it's important to understand that none of them is omniscient or none of them is fully comprehensive. It's as fragmentary as all the other evidence we have. And that means, I think, one of the tasks is to bring them into dialogue, try to make them talk to each other. I hope I have caught the question. Yes?
Yeah. So I think, Peter, you've already kind of partly answered it, but still, I wanted to ask that, is this obsession with universalism, does it also come because the way the theater has been used by other disciplines? You've of course looked into anthropology, but if you see even sociology or psychoanalysis, they have used theater to draw a lot of inferences.
Yeah.
And from that perspective, when we come to theater and performance studies, how do we is that the legacy, therefore we want to kind of create a universal, or we need to differentiate from the other disciplines? So that's something, kind of come.
I think I try to give a twofold answer. I think for once, universalism is a very temptive idea for scholars, because it means you make an argument not only for your small tiny case of some southern German city no one knows outside of Germany about, but you make a claim that is true for the entire mankind. So I think this is the luring temptation. And especially if you think of many of the usages that psychoanalysis has taken of theater, it sort of exactly comes with this idea that sort of we have something that's comparatively hands-on, and it promises us to solve the riddle of the human being. I would be skeptical. The second point is, of course, that there's a certain kind of dynamic unfolding in the post-1968 academic world, where being universalist also means to be successful, because you sort of sell your product to others and make them follow the pattern, instead of sort of rather seeking out how could we sort of negotiate a practice of conversation and mutual dialogue.
Yeah, so in the diagram there was this point, the second point I guess, that we have to admit that there's a lack of source, and also that we need to have a language that can help us understand or talk about it better, the theater and the performances. But to what extent is that really even possible, because it's ultimately, for the most part, something that is mostly paralinguistic, the performances and theaters. So how close can language ever come to really being able to, facilitate any discussion whatsoever?
Thank you. I think that's the most fundamental question in the field of theater and performance studies, but it also addresses questions in other fields of the humanities, and that is, can we maintain the idea of a scholarly discourse even when we deal with phenomena that might slip through our net of words? My very pragmatic and a little bit tongue-in-cheek response would be, let's try harder. Because otherwise it would mean that we give up on the idea of the scholarly dialogue. And I think there have been very important approaches, and very successful approaches, to think, for example, about performance as research in the way of conveying insights that you cannot sort of just do by reading books or by linguistic analysis, but still trying to communicate these insights linguistically. This is really the task of a scholarly community, because otherwise we fall apart into idiosyncratic single communities that barely are able to be in dialogue with anyone else. I'm thinking of the case of the Polish director Jerzy Grotowski. Jerzy Grotowski sort of was a very influential director in the 60s and 70s, and he developed a very provocative program of poor theater. But there was a certain point in his artistic biography, and also in the people who work on Grotowski, where it almost became incommunicable what they were doing. It became a mystery. And I can respect that, but I think as a scholar I would say it has to be our challenge and our task to seek for this language. And I think that can be much more fun than it looks like. This is what IFTR is for, right, Madam President? President, sorry. I knew this would happen. No, but I'm serious. I think this is why we do this kind of thing. This is why we do this networking, is really sort of testing our own insights. And can I make a snarky remark? I'm not, as you all have realized from the scratch, I'm not a native speaker of English. I keep people assuring that in my mother tongue I'm rather quick and witty, and sort of I'm stumbling through English, and I always apologize to every native speaker for what I do to the language. I think, and this is partly with a wink to my daughter, I think there was a good time when humanities were conducted in Latin, because this was no one's mother tongue. So there were no issues about pronunciation, no th. So this was a plain dead language everyone sort of could use, and I'm sure that Cicero has cried a lot about the usage of Latin, but who cared, right? But the more serious point is, what I try to make is, really seeking a language, that's a task. And it really, I think we should pay more attention to that. We should pay more attention to how we talk about the subjects we talk about, and how we cultivate the practice of talking to each other. I think and if you hear political overtones, yes, they are all meant. I think we are losing the ability to talk to each other and to debate. And this has to do with exactly the point to say, how do we find a common language?
So, as you were mentioning about...
I think you need to speak up a little bit, sorry.
So as you were mentioning about the body and ritual, that thing, like I wanted to ask you about, like as Brahm sir also pointed out, ki, when so I wanted to ask you about this key when you're talking about bodies and all, and as Brahm sir also pointed out that key when you don't have literature around, if suppose something is happening inside my community and all, and then there you will not be able to find any literature and all sort of thing. So how do we study all those things where you have been able to see ki, okay, something is happening here on a bodily level, but again there is no literature. So should we again go towards this Nietzsche and all and try to connect the dots, or I don't know.
Thanks. I guess I got your question. So the question is, how do we deal with phenomena and parts of phenomena where we don't have any linguistic record at all, where sort of something that escapes description, sometimes deliberately is obscured from description. We have many of these cases. For example, when we talk about rituals and customs, in many cases, sort of this is something that is kept. And I think the important point is to get as close as possible to the point where the silence starts. And sometimes we can do some guessing. So when Amit and I were chatting before, and Amit said, do you want me to do something special? And I said, can you juggle? And he said, actually, I can. As someone who is notoriously left-handed, which is a German proverb for being not able to juggle and not to run with scissors at all, I know that in the art of juggling gets a lot of training and skill, physical skills. There are very few written documentations on someone trained a juggler in the early modern period. But we can gather from the performance that there must have been some training, even if we don't know how and when it happened. So I think it is sort of getting as close to the point of the performance and trying to read, for example, the physical action, and trying to understand what must have been gone into the ability to do something like that. And I think this is the closest we get to many of these practices that sometimes people didn't think worth to write down. Sometimes people deliberately obscured from others. But I think it's a reality of social life. So I'm sure many of you know the case of a specific dish your grandmother used to cook in a specific way that made it extremely unique. And that was a secret ingredient that only was passed on from mouth to ear, or sometimes never. And sometimes sort of it's just a memory we have of something, we don't know how it happened. And I think this is the same is true for performance, that we sort of sometimes see there must have been training, an ingredient, an idea gone into that. Sometimes we see the purpose of obscuring the manufacturing of it. And then we need to go back to guessing and sort of trying to understand as much as possible. But again, therefore, it's important to find this joint language, to share the moment, to say, this is how far I got. And this is when I don't understand, this is my guessing. And then to have someone saying, I think it's reasonable or unreasonable, I can follow it. But this would be the difference, from my point of view, between scholarly art and, for example, artistic practice or artistic enthusiasm, sort of which might be as real. I'm not sort of valuing one over the other, but sort of trying the ability to communicate it. I think this is what makes the difference for a scholarly purpose. So that would be my response.
Any question?
Yes, sorry.
No, this is just a clarificatory question. Like, the art spectrancy, like that word, you've translated it as literacy, right?
Yeah.
Like, so I was also thinking that, what is that, because when we talk about literacy, we are usually talking about it in terms of writing and reading, right? Like, largely, like in the earlier part of the presentation also, and I think even in Akash's question, this whole problem of language or linguistic mediation and play, right? Like, how do we build on that problematic and, and memory in that sense, right? What do we do with that problem?
So this is one of my failing attempts to bring Latin back as a lingua franca. And sort of I've chosen the Latin term. It means the art of looking. Because I think one of the interesting issues, and I'm in Cologne, I'm also teaching media studies, and I'm always stunned that there's a tacit assumption that realism is something we understand, we just have to open the eyes and to look. And I think we have lost the recognition of the fact that we get trained in specific aesthetic languages. And I think we also have lost the acknowledgement of the fact that we all have different grammars of watching. And that this starts very early on. Sometimes we even go as far as to assume that people from earlier periods were less smart than we are. Self-flattering as that is, and I can see the pleasure of self-flattering, I think it's a really temptation we must resist. So trying to understand the different grammars to watch and to acknowledge them as an act of literacy, I think is genuinely important. And also, in Europe, for example, puppetry is nowadays considered to be an art form, especially for children. The reason escapes me a little bit, I have to say, but sort of we assume that sort of this doesn't require much of an intellectual effort. But whoever has seen children watching a puppet show sort of realizes that it really takes some time to acknowledge to learn the grammar, to watch that properly. And this is why an artist sort of is in the plural, so I try to sort of stress the fact that it's a plurality of grammars we all have in our bones.
The question is, how does one look at the failed performance for the material realities that interfered and manifested themselves that prevented the performance from being or becoming? Can these be seen as moments of social and material rupture in construction of cultural practice?
Thank you so much. Somewhere in the 9th century, in the territory what is today the Iraq, the governor of the city, being a Muslim, commissioned a performer, a Jewish performer he had heard about, to perform a shadow play. And the performer did, up to the point when the audience got so nervous that they sort of captured the poor performer and executed him eventually, because they assumed that he would be a conjurer. This is interesting, an interesting case, and we have several sources for comparable events, because it means the act of communication that a performance fails utterly. So the performer is presenting images while the audience uses a different ars spectandi and reads them utterly differently. This is also interesting in points of an intercultural dialogue that is not successful, but is failing for different reasons. But it also shows that sort of performance sort of can be brought out in these fields of dialogue. In many cases, these events are only, chronicled in weird sources, police file acts, weird chronicles. But it also means to develop this language to read that sometimes something that is described as a sacrilege or an offense might have a different background and might have sort of come from a different context and from a different constellation. So it might call for our attention to try to put it in a different context to make it readable as part of this failure. I'm saying this partly, and I was sort of making this argument about the failed performances, because for a long time, theater history was written like literary history as the chain of masterpieces. One masterpiece after the other, one innovation after the other. But I think what is more important to look at these social constellations and also to acknowledge when something did not go through, when someone went broke because he misjudged the reaction of the audience. When someone sort of put something forth that obviously steered affects in the audience in a completely wrong way. So failure is interesting because it's also an act of communication. It might not be the artistic achievement that happens here, but clearly the social interaction is happening.